بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I would like to also express my appreciation and my profound gratitude for being invited to speak with you and to you about my work, but also to hear the moving stories and anecdotes about Professor Ali Mazrui and your various respective relationships to him, both personal and intellectual. I feel welcomed by you, and I'm very happy to be a part of this community, as I now think of myself. What I want to simply do is just provide a summary of my paper. And so I'll start by talking about the tariqa that I'm looking at. So right now I'm looking at a tariqa called the Mustafawiya, the tariqa Mustafawiya. And this is a tariqa that originates in Senegal, and a sheikh by the name of Arunafai al-Fakir moved to the United States from Sierra Leone, where he was working at that time, to Moncks Corner, South Carolina, in 1994. And so for the past 2 decades, he's been teaching and helping people learn about the religion of Islam and helping them cultivate themselves as Muslims there and in other places throughout the United States. And so the majority of his students in Moncks Corner are African American. There are some Caucasian Muslims as well. And so the purpose of my work as an anthropologist is to, and as a Muslim intellectual, I guess you could say, is to sort of think about, is to look at this community. And right now I'm writing my dissertation, and for the past year I've lived with this community while taking some short breaks to come back to my family, etc. And so my ultimate project is to do an ethnography of an American Zawiya. That is a community that is profoundly informed by West African Sufism, right? A particular approach to understanding Islam, right? And so there are some things that I'm concerned with regard to my work, which is to sort of think about how mobility, how history and memory are sort of mobilized by the performances, worship that take place in this community. And so just really briefly, I want to talk a little bit about 2 things. And so in the paper, I talk about 2 sites of pilgrimage and sort of relate those sites to questions of memory. And so the first is Moncks Corner, South Carolina itself. And so it's a small blue-collar town that has about less than 10,000 residents, about 4.5 miles in size, located about a 45, maybe 35-minute drive northwest of Charleston. And so at the core of what I want to do is sort of think about the cultivation of religious subjectivities and the sort of actual practice of a diaspora, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And so I do that through attending to everyday discourses of future mobility and sort of practices of consumption that take place in this community. And then the construction of an African diasporic selfhood in the context of American-born Muslims in order to gather a fuller picture of the impact of travel on mobile Muslim identities, both in Africa and the United States. And so I also talk a little bit about Mazrui's notion of a triple heritage, and sort of relay that to this idea of a triple consciousness, right? That is the sort of being African elsewhere or being Muslim in the West. How those 2 things sort of situate identities, right? And how those identities become mobilized through these varying relationships, this sort of tripartite ontology. And then I also talk a little bit about thinking about West African Sufism as a possible site of convergence, and I'll talk about divergence and convergence in a second. And so my work asks, what local routes of travel and relations built between two central sites of pilgrimage, one in Moncks Corner, South Carolina, the other in Chess, Senegal, the sort of point of origination for the tariqa at large. What these two sites can tell us about transnational networks and how they merge into diasporic locations of remembrance. And moreover, I ask about, my work opens up questions about rihla, or travel, particularly for the sake of scholarship, zakara, memory, related to zikr, right? And khayal, or imagination, right? How people imagine themselves, particularly as they pertain to African-descended Muslims in the context of a Senegalese Muslim tradition. And so, to talk a little bit about the Moncks Corner Mosque a little bit, which is named Muhajirrun wal Ansar, which translates roughly as a place of prostration for migrants and their assistants, or and their helpers. Right? And Muhajirrun in this instance are those that migrate for the purpose of seeking refuge in the Zawiya of Moncks Corner, seeking closeness to God, particularly guided by the tutelage of Sheikh Arunafai. As such, the Zawiya operates as a proper site of pilgrimage for tariqa members. And on the other hand, the Ansar are those that live in the West, or in Moncks Corner, born there, etc., and allow for a certain kind of mobility. And so during the earlier stages of my research, I lived with the community, as I mentioned earlier, and I quickly learned that there's a small handful of men who actually live in the mosque on a more than part-time basis. The Sheikh has named his community the Fuqara, the dependents. And so I think about the way in which the men who live in the mosque live a willful life of dependence and map that onto a sort of spiritual understanding of self, recognizing an utter dependence on Allah, but also dependence on the community in a certain kind of way. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well, or maybe during Q&A. I don't want to take away from other things that I want to talk about. So a little bit more about the mosque itself, without going into much detail for the sake of the last sort of 15 minutes that I have. The mosque is currently situated on land that was formerly a slave plantation. The name of it is Gippi Plantation in Moncks Corner, South Carolina, and it straddles the land opposite of Old Highway 52, which is a two-lane road that separates it from the mosque. It boasts a gleaming white house, quite reminiscent of days long past in American history. Most of the land that comprised Gippi Plantation has been now partitioned into residential properties, but yet in spite of its shrinking, it still imposes itself through its black iron gates and large white house. As I spoke to some of the community members about their just experiences living in the community, why they moved there, or why they have joined the Zawiya, throughout the everyday discourse, they talk about, or there's a way in which the trauma, particularly for African American Muslims, of enslavement emerges. And at the same time, throughout the past year, we see a proliferation of responses to state-sanctioned violence, particularly that enacted upon people of color in this country. At the same time, Moncks Corner shares a particularly special relationship to Charleston. Historically, it should be mentioned that, going back, Charleston is located about 30 to 40 minutes driving from Charleston, which historically has been a port city through which upwards of 60% of all enslaved Africans were forcibly migrated into the American South. You all may know of a man by the name of Omar ibn Said, who was a Senegalese Muslim scholar, was enslaved and brought into North America through Charleston, and would be enslaved for the remainder of his life. It is this example that provides an excellent metaphor for the discourses that occur in Moncks Corner. As members, some who have relocated from northern urban centers, discuss the legacy of enslaved African Muslims in the American South and participate in envisioning themselves returning home to Senegal. And so this question of reversion, this question of return, emerges in these sort of everyday interactions that I've had with members, and also discussions that they have amongst themselves. I'm actually going to skip over the discussion of chess for the sake of being able to talk a little bit more about Ali Mazrui and my relationship to his work. The Zawiya of Moncks Corner, that is the Muslim community of Moncks Corner, operates as a node within a larger spiritual transnational network, whereby shuyukh, students, guests and visitors, act as a safe haven for the traveler. There are a number of ways that the Zawiya of Moncks Corner, like any Zawiya perhaps, allows for multiple kinds of mobility. Aside from physical migration, there's also spiritual mobility, which actually compels the traveler to embark upon his journey. And it's this quest for inward cultivation of the heart, the desire to crush the ego, to steal the nafs, that animates the limbs to migrate the seeker towards that which is sought. And this is the point where the seeker enters onto the path toward God. The Zawiya, in other words, acts as an infrastructure for mobility, where perhaps the sheikh acts as a trusted guide and door to the path. With regard to Moncks Corner itself, there's a manner in which the reverse is also true. Multiple students, say for example, a sister by the name of Marjana Ibrahim, who I had the pleasure of meeting and learning from, has relocated to Moncks Corner in order to move closer to her sheikh. And so students like her have physically migrated in order to better embark on a spiritual journey to God. And so there's a way in which physical mobility allows for a certain kind of spiritual mobility. One of the other things that I am looking at in my work is to sort of think about diaspora both as an ontology and praxis, whereby people collectively envision themselves to be dispersed from some ancestral home, whether real or imagined, not fictive, and aligned through a solidarity built upon ideas of return, where negotiating multiple attachments to both homeland and residence take place. And so I relate this to the question of zikr, right? In the case of the Moncks Corner Zawiya, zikr, or remembrance, particularly remembrance of God, operates as a connective device that heightens ontologies of dispersion, I find. And so every Saturday evening, for example, the entire mosque gathers after Maghrib prayer to sing the qasidas composed by Sheikh Mustafa Gai Haidara, the initiator of the Mustafa Tariqa back in 1966. And I argue that there is a manner by which zikr is deployed as a means of zakara, right? A different order of memory, a route through which one envisions home for diasporized Muslims of African descent, particularly those that are part of the Tariqa Mustafi. And so related to this is the question of khayal, imagination. And so far we've talked about travel, that is mobility, as diasporic praxis, or the practice of diaspora. And now we're talking about bodily performance, particularly as one that sort of activates a diasporic ontology, or the experience of being dispersed. And so what most interests me here is the multiple ways that remembrance can be understood. And so zikr, in this case, is both at once a form of bodily practice, that is a corporeal form of memory, and a form of social memory amongst and between two highly mobile groups of diasporic Africans. Insofar as it's argued that a significant portion of enslaved Africans that were brought across the waters during the Triangle Trade were Muslim, specifically Sylvain Diouf, Michael Gomez, etc., can we speak of something being regained or rediscovered amongst their descendants, specifically African American Muslims, who participate in West African modes of religious practice and pedagogy? Does the animating of West African configurations of spiritual remembrance through African American voices point to multiple ways we can understand memory? And so inside of these questions are concerned with three tasks: to deeply engage the notion of collective memory, of religious subjectivity, and of course to grapple with a rich discourse on diaspora. The relevance of my work, I feel, has much to offer all three of these fields, in my estimation, and can specifically fill a void in the field of anthropology, the discipline through which I'm thinking from. And so, thank you. I want to now sort of shift into speaking about Ali Mazrui's impact on my work. And so in 1986, Ali Mazrui articulated the manner in which African identities have historically been formed from indigenous ways of seeing the world in self, European capitalist forces, and the presence of Islam as a site of cultural and political power. He conceived that African people largely should be understood as having a triple heritage, a kind of trifold consciousness that constitutes African identities, and ontologies particularized by complex relationships to local traditions, foreign colonial intrusions, and the pervasiveness of a transformative religion. For my work, I find that the notion of a triple heritage, is much akin to W.E.B. Du Bois's description of a double consciousness that provides a language that articulates the complicated and shifting sites of belonging that Muslims of African descent living in the West negotiate. While double consciousness refers to specific Black American ontologies birthed from histories of racial tension and societal exclusion, triple consciousness then refers to a Muslim ontology or Muslim experience in a predominantly non-Muslim environment whereby Islamophobic rhetorics yield a kind of exclusion of a different order. During the past year spent living in Moncks Corner, South Carolina, I've witnessed the manner in which recent national discourses around police violence directed toward people of color has affected the kinds of informal conversations shared between community members of the Tariqa. On the other hand, there have been multiple instances in which the ways that Black identities mobilize within a broader Muslim body in the United States and beyond, particularly with regard to identifying the need for institution building, independent of funds external to Black communities, have emerged out of discussions shared within and across the Moncks Corner Zawiya. As I write this, there is currently a community-wide effort to purchase the building and land on which the Moncks Corner Mosque is situated. Sheikh Fahd has made it a point to mention that while he could easily reach out to various wealthy admirers and colleagues elsewhere to gather the funds needed for the purchase, he wants this community, comprised largely of African-American blue-collar laborers, to be able to gather the funds needed for the purchase on their own. And he's explicitly contrasted the seeming financial paralysis of Black American Muslim communities with the ability of South Asian and Arab Muslim communities to erect institutions in kind, while also fashioning such spaces that have historically marginalized African American Muslims. And at the same time, Sheikh Fahd has explained that that a special prayer called the Salatul Samawiyah has been given to his Sheikh Mustafa Gai Haidara, specifically for Black people as a means for raising their spiritual rank, their maqam. In this way, the Tariqa itself becomes a site of discourses for Black uplift, not just economically, but spiritually as well. And these discourses highlight not just cleavages between Black identities, belonging in an American context, but also sheds light upon rifts within migrant Muslim communities that also contribute to a tripartite Black American Muslim experience. Mazrui, in 2004, identified a four-phase schema of convergence and divergence of relations between the United States and the larger Muslim world. In it, he outlines the primary phase begins with a narrative of value-based convergence, whereby American values and traditional Muslim values are aligned. Yet, we're more physically divergent insofar as the majority of Muslims were not able to migrate into the United States at that period. That is the first half of the 20th century. The second phase, on the other hand, includes a spatial convergence in the latter half of the 20th century due to increased migration patterns to the United States. And so that combines with an ideological divergence between an American polity and a Muslim polity brought about but largely by increased American liberalism, particularly around questions of sex, marriage, and consumption that contrast sharply with sort of Muslim values. And so this divergence would deepen after the tragedy of September 11th of 2001, whereby American political rhetorics would render Muslimness incompatible with Americanness. In other words, Islam would become an imagined site of inherent violence, unreason, religious extremism, and thus these misperceptions were indiscriminately and wholly heaped onto an entire Muslim body during this third phase. I would say that the foundation of my work here responds to the challenge that Mazrui offers when emphasizing the fact that African discourses have profoundly impacted the West and Islam by virtue of its effect on the mobilization of black religious identities in the United States in particular. And so what I'm essentially gesturing towards is the manner by which we might pay closer attention to the role that West African Sufism plays in American religious discourses, even if on a micro level or in local contexts, and on American spirituality in general. In this regard, West African Sufism is particularly salient as it offers a counter-narrative against a backdrop of global political frenzies surrounding religious extremism, fueled by Western rhetorics that pose Islam or Islamism, Muslims, as somehow drastically other and incompatible with a democratic, pluralistic idea of society. Right? And so furthermore, I argue that we might pay attention to how West African Sufic trends, deployed particularly by American Muslims, acts as a site of convergence, albeit uneven, possibly, that Mazrui identified as a futuristic fourth phase. And so at once, participation in West African Sufi traditions both further globalizes American Muslim members by fully embedding them into transnational spiritual networks, and also localizes globally minded participants by emphasizing civic duty, pastoral care, and religious moderation through spiritual inclination. In the case of the Monks Corner Zawiya, students of Sheikh Ronafai, whose tendencies or desire to travel to specific locations, such as the Senegambia or to Cordoba in Spain, for example, have been greatly increased due to participation in a transnational spiritual network, where each respective local Zawiya, whether in the West Africa, the USA, or Europe, views itself in relation to the larger network. I'll stop there. Thank you.